The rain began before dawn, washing over the English coast like a grey curtain. Somewhere deep inside a nondescript brick building in London, a map flickered under the dim light of a single lamp. Cigarette smoke curled through the air. The map was covered in strings, flags, and inked notes, the kind of map that could decide life and death for millions. But there was one problem. Every position marked on it was a lie, a deception so vast, so intricate, that it would rewrite the rules of war. The 1st U.S. Army Group, commanded by none other than General George S. Patton, the Allies' most aggressive, unpredictable general, was preparing to strike across the Strait of Dover. Tanks lined up by the hundreds, landing craft waited along the beaches, and radio chatter buzzed with invasion codes. German intelligence picked up every signal, every word, every transmission, and they believed it all, but the tanks were rubber. The radio calls were fake, the soldiers were mannequins, and the army itself didn't exist. This is the true story of Operation Bodyguard, the greatest deception in modern warfare. The plan that blinded the German high command, reshaped the Normandy invasion, and left entire divisions chasing ghosts that vanished into thin air. By the winter of 1943, the Allies were preparing for the single greatest amphibious assault in human history. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, would be the turning point of World War II. But the question that haunted every general, from Eisenhower to Montgomery, was simple. Where would they land? To succeed, they had to keep the Germans guessing, to make Hitler believe that the invasion would come not in Normandy, but somewhere else entirely. And to pull it off, they would have to invent an army from thin air. It began inside a modest office at 54 Broadway, home to the London Controlling Section, that a small, secretive branch of British intelligence tasked with military deception. Its leader, Colonel John Bevan, had the cold precision of a chess player and the imagination of a novelist. To him, maps weren't geography, they were illusion. "We're not fighting with guns here," he once said. "We're fighting with perception." In early 1944, Bevan and his team conceived Operation Bodyguard, an elaborate web of lies designed to protect the real invasion by surrounding it with false ones. Under its umbrella came a dozen sub-operations, each one more audacious than the last. The most famous of them would be Operation Fortitude. The deception aimed at convincing the Germans that the main assault would strike the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, rather than the beaches of Normandy. To make it believable, the Allies built a phantom army, the 1st U.S. Army Group FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, the man the Germans feared most. They believed Patton to be in disgrace after slapping a soldier in Sicily, but also the only Allied commander bold enough to lead an invasion across the Channel. The irony was delicious, so they gave him an army, one that existed entirely in imagination. The deception began in the English countryside. Empty fields were transformed into sprawling military camps. Inflatable Sherman tanks built from rubberized canvas stood in perfect formation under camouflage nets. Entire airfields appeared overnight, complete with wooden airplanes, fake runways, and rows of fuel drums filled with sand. From the air, it looked perfect, indistinguishable from a real army preparing for war. German reconnaissance planes flew over regularly, snapping photographs of the encampments. When analysts in Berlin examined them, they were convinced the Allies were massing for a massive strike at Calais. But the illusion couldn't rely on visuals alone. It needed sound. It needed chatter. It needed life. Enter the Signal Corps deception units, experts in the art of fake communication. Using elaborate systems of radio operators, they created false transmissions for entire divisions, conversations between officers, logistical orders, convoy movements. Everything followed the patterns of a real army's network. To the German eavesdroppers, it was flawless. Even the smallest details were accounted for. Soldiers in nearby towns were instructed to wear insignia of the fake divisions. Supply trucks were sent out in daylight with markings belonging to the non-existent FUSAG. Bar gossip was accidentally overheard by double agents. Every move, every rumor, every flicker of information, all carefully planted to build the myth. At the same time, the Allies used one of their most valuable assets: double agents. Chief among them was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. A Spanish spy who had once offered his services to Germany, he had now been turned into one of Britain's most effective deceivers. Through a network of entirely imaginary sub-agents, Garbo fed German intelligence hundreds of fabricated reports, all confirming that the invasion would strike Calais. Hitler believed him completely. In April 1944, as D-Day approached, the deception shifted into overdrive. Fusag's presence in southeastern England became impossible to ignore. Aerial reconnaissance showed tank concentrations, supply dumps, landing craft massed in the Thames estuary. The Luftwaffe even recorded engine noise coming from the region, playback recordings broadcast by giant speakers hidden in hedgerows. Meanwhile, in Normandy, real troops of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions trained in near-total secrecy. Their camps were camouflaged, their movements restricted. Few even knew their destination. The Germans watched and waited. When General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, reviewed the intelligence reports, he was convinced. The main assault, he told Hitler, will be at Calais. Normandy is a diversion. Hitler agreed, and issued an order that would decide the fate of the war. The 15th Army, nearly 20 divisions, would remain in Calais. They were not to move south under any circumstances until the real invasion was confirmed. That single decision, based entirely on a lie, would seal Germany's fate. The spring of 1944 was a season of illusions. Across southern England, villages and fields had transformed into a grand theater of war, but one where almost every actor was a ghost. The 1st U.S. Army Group, though entirely fictional, now lived and breathed in the minds of German intelligence. Its divisions had been numbered, its insignias designed, its logistics meticulously forged. And the more the deception grew, the harder it became to tell where truth ended and imagination began. At Folkestone, along the Kent coastline, vast staging areas appeared to bustle with military activity. Truck convoys rumbled in and out at all hours. Cranes loaded crates stamped with Fusag onto flat cars. Engineers erected rows of Quonset huts. From the cliffs, it looked like an army ready to move. But up close, one would see the trick. Tires stuffed with straw, engines without fuel, shadows cast over emptiness. German reconnaissance aircraft, their engines droning high above, captured it all in blurry photographs that seemed to confirm every fear Berlin held. Intelligence officers in France pored over the prints under magnifying lamps, tracing the lines of fake runways and dummy vehicles. Patton's army is ready, one report concluded. The invasion is imminent. Inside London's War Office, the deception architects watched the trap take shape. Colonel John Bevan stood beside a wall-sized map of northern France, his fingers tracing the coast from Cherbourg to Calais. Every hour they hesitate is an hour gained, he said. The room was filled with tension, planners, cryptographers, and intelligence officers working in perfect synchrony. On the far side of the table, Eisenhower's aide, Colonel Walter Bedell Smith, nodded grimly. "We're gambling everything on a mirage," he said. Bevan smiled faintly. "And that's the beauty of it." For the operation to succeed, deception had to become indistinguishable from reality. Every layer of Allied communication, every broadcast, every movement of a supply convoy had to reinforce the illusion that Fusag, the Phantom Army, was preparing to storm Calais. To that end, the Allies turned to the Special Means Section, a team of double agents and counterintelligence officers whose task was to manipulate the German Abwehr through controlled leaks. Leading them was Garbo, the Spaniard who, by now, was revered by German intelligence as their most reliable source. Through his fictitious network of 27 sub-agents, all invented by British handlers, Garbo sent Berlin a stream of detailed reports, troop numbers, ship movements, fuel deliveries, even the daily weather conditions in Kent. The reports were long, meticulously formatted and full of tiny, verifiable truths, a technique known as double-texture deception. A real event would be wrapped in a greater lie, giving it authenticity. When German analysts compared Garbo's information with intercepted signals from Allied radio traffic, everything aligned. The illusion became ironclad. By May, Hitler was convinced that Normandy was a diversion. "The decisive battle," he wrote in his daily directive, "will occur at the Pas de Calais. All preparations must assume this, and so, as Allied invasion fleets secretly assembled along the southern coast for the real D-Day. The German 15th Army, the strongest in France, sat idle in its bunkers, staring north toward an army that did not exist. Meanwhile, in the quiet English towns behind the deception lines, soldiers who did exist went about their part in the theater. Units of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the so-called Ghost Army, specialized in visual, sonic, and radio trickery. Using rubber, plywood, and ingenuity, they created the illusion of life where there was none. Corporal George Martin, an artist before the war, recalled later, "We inflated tanks in the morning and deflated them at night. Sometimes we moved them 500 yards just to make it look like a new unit had arrived." Sound engineers from Hollywood's Warner Brothers studio had even joined the effort, bringing portable speakers and massive amplifiers to simulate the roar of armored divisions. The recordings were layered with authentic sounds. Engines starting, hatches slamming, shouted orders. Played across open fields, the noise carried for miles. Nearby villagers watched in disbelief as phantom columns moved through the fog, their noise echoing through the hills. From above, German reconnaissance pilots photographed tire tracks carved by jeeps into the mud, tracks that went nowhere. Each illusion fed the next. Every night, trains carrying wooden crates labeled as tank parts rumbled through London, their destinations broadcast over open radio channels. But inside the crates were only air hoses and sandbags. The deception became so elaborate that even some Allied soldiers not briefed on Bodyguard began to believe in Fusag's existence. Letters home mentioned Patton's army gathering for the big push. Rumors spread across mess halls, reaching even those who would storm Normandy without realizing the shadow army behind them was a lie. On June 5, 1944, the storm broke, literally. Winds howled across the channel, delaying the invasion by 24 hours. Inside the Southwick House Command Center, Eisenhower's staff debated whether to launch the assault at all. "If we delay again," said Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, "we lose the tide window. We'll be forced to wait another 2 weeks." Eisenhower stood by the window, his reflection ghosted in the rain-streaked glass. Behind him, a clock ticked toward midnight. "The Germans think Patton's about to strike Calais," he said. "We can use that." He turned to Bevan. "Make sure the illusion holds. We move tomorrow." At 0630 hours, June 6th, D-Day. As American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the world's attention turned to the thunder of war. But in Berlin, the reaction was confusion. Reports flooded in. Allied troops had landed near Caen, Cherbourg, and the Cotentin Peninsula. Hitler's generals demanded clarity. Was this the main attack or a feint? The deception had worked too well. Intercepted German communications revealed that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, refused to commit the reserves at Calais. "It's a diversion," he told OKW headquarters. The main attack is still to come. For 2 crucial weeks, as Allied forces bled across the hedgerows of Normandy, nearly 250,000 German troops remained stationary along the Calais coast, waiting for Patton's non-existent army to land. Every day they waited was another day the Allies gained ground. Garbo continued feeding Berlin his masterpiece. On June 9th, he transmitted a coded message claiming that the Normandy landings were a preliminary feint, and that the main blow will come within 48 hours at the Pas de Calais. Hitler read it himself. He ordered the 15th Army to hold position. The lie had become truth. By late June, as Cherbourg fell and the Allies began pushing inland, the German High Command grew desperate for clarity. Luftwaffe reconnaissance sorties were launched over Dover, searching for evidence of movement. They found exactly what the Allies wanted them to see: fresh tire tracks, new fuel dumps, lines of dummy tanks still perfectly intact. The Luftwaffe photographs reached Hitler's desk on June 29th. He studied them in silence, his hand trembling slightly as he traced the shadows on the paper. "Patton will strike here," he said. "You will see." But Patton wasn't there. He was in Normandy, visiting real soldiers, inspecting real blood, real mud, and real graves. The deception had not only tricked the Germans, it had reshaped the very identity of the invasion. Back in London, the team at the London controlling section gathered around their encrypted telexes. The room was silent except for the rhythmic clatter of the machine. The latest intercept confirmed it. German reserves at Calais had been ordered to stand down for another week. Colonel Bevan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally breaking through his composure. "Then we've done it," he whispered. A few laughed. A few cried. But most just sat in silence, realizing the weight of what had been accomplished, that the greatest deception in modern warfare had held firm at the exact moment it mattered most. Outside, the city's sirens wailed faintly in the distance, echoing through the London fog. No one spoke. The war still raged on, but something fundamental had shifted. The battle for truth and lies had been won by illusion. The map lay sprawled across Hitler's command table in the Wolf's Lair, its creases stained with sweat and ink. Dozens of red pins marked the French coastline, stretching from Cherbourg to Dunkirk. But the thickest cluster, the one that drew every officer's gaze, sat over the Pas de Calais. Hitler's finger hovered there as though touching destiny itself. "Here," he said. "This is where they will come." The map, updated daily from intercepted Allied communications and Luftwaffe reconnaissance, was believed to represent the exact situation of the Western Front. But every inch of it, every troop symbol, every supply line, every airfield had been poisoned by Allied deception. It wasn't a map of truth. It was a masterpiece of fiction, and for nearly 2 months the German High Command would command their war from this lie. In early July 1944, Normandy was a cauldron. The beaches had been secured, but the breakout was slow, bloody, and costly. German panzer divisions fought tenaciously through hedgerows so thick they seemed alive, turning each field into a miniature fortress. Yet in Berlin, confidence remained strangely high. Hitler's intelligence reports insisted that the Allies' main invasion force, Fusag under Patton, had not yet moved. Every day, intercepted Allied radio transmissions confirmed continued buildup across southern England. Reconnaissance over Kent showed fresh equipment. The Führer's staff told him what he wanted to hear. Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion was coming. Any day now. Even as German troops were being annihilated in the Bocage, reinforcements were withheld from Normandy. The 15th Army at Calais, 250,000 men strong, waited under strict orders to hold position. Generals pleaded for release of the divisions. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, sent urgent telegrams from the front, warning that Normandy was the main battle. "We must strike now or we will be driven into the Seine," he wrote. But his words fell on deaf ears. On July 17th, Rommel's car was strafed by a British fighter near Livarot. He was gravely wounded, evacuated to Germany, and soon out of the war. His absence sealed the deception's success. There was no one left near Hitler with enough authority to break the illusion. Inside the Wolf's Lair, General Alfred Jodl presented the day's briefing. "Our latest intercepts show heavy signals traffic from the Dover area," he said, pointing at the red-marked region on the map. "We believe Patton's forces are preparing to cross within the next 48 hours. Normandy remains secondary." Hitler nodded slowly, satisfied. "Then we wait." Hours later in London, the team at the London controlling section read the same intercepts. Their own fabrications mirrored back through the German command structure. "They've doubled down," said Bevan, staring at the decoded message. "They're still watching the ghost." Every false signal, every fabricated movement, every coded whisper had become the backbone of Germany's intelligence briefings. The enemy wasn't just fooled. They were operating inside the illusion. By now, Operation Bodyguard had taken on a life of its own. The deception wasn't simply protecting the Normandy landings. It was shaping the German response across the entire Western Front. Even when Allied armor began breaking out at St. Lo, even when the U.S. Third Army under Patton, the real Patton, began its lightning advance toward Brittany, the Germans refused to believe he was real. Hitler's staff dismissed reports of Patton's tanks crossing France as decoys. According to their map, his army was still in England. As July turned to August, the illusion began to crack, but not before it had done its job. On August 1st, Operation Cobra shattered the German line at St. Lo. Allied forces burst from the hedgerows, sweeping south and east in a tidal surge of armor. Town after town fell. German communications broke down. Entire divisions vanished in encirclement. And still the 15th Army stayed at Calais. Even as reports poured in of Allied tanks near Paris, Hitler refused to redeploy them. Patton's strike will come at Calais, he insisted on August 10th. The Normandy attack is only a diversionary thrust. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. In the war rooms of Chief, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the architects of deception watched their plan reach its climax. On August 15th, intercepts confirmed that the Germans still believed in a second invasion wave from Dover. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park read the decrypted messages with disbelief. "They're still waiting for an army that doesn't exist," one analyst said. John Bevan sat in silence, staring at the wall map. "Then we've won twice," he murmured, "once with guns and once with lies." Across the Channel, the reality of the deception began to surface in the chaos of retreat. German officers captured in Normandy described the confusion at headquarters. Orders arrived late or contradicted themselves. Commanders refused to move without direct authorization from Berlin. Some believed they were holding out for reinforcements from Calais that never came. At Falaise, where Allied forces encircled 50,000 Germans, one officer reportedly told his captors, "We were waiting for Patton to land behind you." The Americans laughed. The German officer didn't. The map that had guided Hitler's war, the one covered in red pins and ink, was now a monument to failure. Every arrow pointed toward an invasion that had never existed. It was a lie so powerful it had consumed its own creators. When Allied intelligence officers examined captured documents weeks later, they were astonished. German situation reports still listed 1st U.S. Army Group as an active threat. Entire divisions were assigned to counter its imaginary landings. Even Luftwaffe patrols had been redirected to shadow its non-existent convoys. Historians would later call it one of the most successful military deceptions in history. But in 1944, for the men who had risked their lives to make it work, it wasn't about glory, it was about survival. Every false transmission, every inflatable tank, every phantom unit had meant fewer bullets, fewer graves, fewer widows. By late August, the Allies were across the Seine. Paris was liberated. The German front in the west had collapsed completely. Operation Bodyguard had done its job, and then some. When the news reached Bevan's office in London, he didn't celebrate. He simply rolled up his map, the true one, and locked it away. "No one will ever believe," he said quietly, "how much of this war was fought with shadows." By the first days of September 1944, the war in France had changed beyond recognition. The German front was no longer a line. It was a broken chain of fragments. Villages once marked in red on Hitler's maps now lay smoldering behind Allied lines. The Wehrmacht, battered and retreating, clung desperately to the borders of the Reich. Yet deep inside the wolf's lair, the deception of Operation Bodyguard still pulsed through the veins of German command like poison that refused to dissipate. In Berlin, the reports continued arriving, distorted reflections of a war already lost. "The 1st U.S. Army Group remains poised across the Channel," one Abwehr update read. "Their landing fleet appears intact. The secondary invasion will strike soon." The illusion lingered long after its architects had moved on. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park read these intercepts with disbelief. They weren't just winning the war of arms. They were still winning the war of imagination. Hitler's faith in the Phantom Army persisted even as his real divisions collapsed. "Patton's blow will come at Calais," he declared again on September 2nd, his finger trembling over the same spot on the same map that had guided his ruin. The irony was cruel. The real Patton was now hundreds of miles away, sweeping east toward the Moselle, cutting into the heart of France with unstoppable momentum. By then, Operation Bodyguard had already achieved what its creators had dreamed: time. Every hour the Germans waited for a second invasion had been bought with the sweat and ingenuity of thousands of deceivers. Yet now that the truth had begun to seep through the cracks, it came too late to save what was left of Hitler's Western armies. In a captured bunker near Falaise, Allied troops uncovered what they called the Black Room, a field intelligence post where German officers had tracked Allied movements. Maps lined the walls, thick with arrows and notes. On one, a red line labeled 1st U.S. Army Group stretched from Dover to Calais, with divisions, corps, and even supply trains meticulously drawn. A Canadian intelligence officer studying it shook his head. "They were fighting ghosts," he muttered. When this evidence reached London, the men of the London controlling section gathered in silence. Colonel Bevan stared at the photographs from Falaise, his hands trembling. The illusion they'd created had become so complete, so all-encompassing, that even the enemy's dead had died believing it. There was no joy in victory, only the heavy realization that truth had become a casualty of war as surely as the men on the beaches. Back in Germany, the collapse of the Western Front triggered chaos at every level of command. The Abwehr, already under suspicion after several failed counterintelligence operations, now faced Hitler's fury. "You've been feeding me lies," he screamed during one briefing. "All of it. Fake divisions, phantom landings, what else have you hidden from me?" No one dared answer. The officers in the room knew that the reports had been their own, built from Allied forgeries so flawless they'd fooled even the sharpest analysts. Their downfall had been inevitable. In mid-September, when Hitler finally accepted that no invasion would come at Calais, the damage was irreversible. Patton's Third Army had already crossed the Meuse. Eisenhower's armies were racing toward Belgium. Paris was liberated. The great deception that had once blinded the Reich now stood as a symbol of its own blindness, a mirror in which the Führer saw only his own delusion. Meanwhile, in England, the ghosts began to fade. The inflatable tanks were deflated, the dummy airfields dismantled, trucks rolled out carrying away wooden aircraft and rubber armor. The men of the Ghost Army were ordered to new assignments, many never told what their work had truly achieved. In quiet barns and empty fields, the remnants of illusion disappeared back into the mist, but not all traces vanished. At Dover, a small shed remained locked until after the war. Inside, engineers found racks of radio equipment still transmitting empty signals, code chatter bouncing across frequencies that no longer mattered. A phantom voice repeating ghost orders to an audience that no longer listened. In London, John Bevan closed the file marked Bodyguard for the last time. The deception had saved thousands of lives and turned the tide of the war, but he knew it had also changed warfare forever. "From now on," he said quietly, "truth will never be enough." The German realization came not with a single event, but with a dawning horror. As the Allies advanced east, captured officers and decoded orders revealed the scale of the deception. General Walter Warlimont of the OKW later confessed, "We had been fighting a phantom. Every move, every counterattack we planned was in response to shadows." By the time this truth reached Hitler, he had already lost faith in his intelligence corps entirely. He dismissed half his analysts, executed several for deliberate misinformation, and swore he would rely only on his instincts. Those instincts would lead him less than a year later into the bunker beneath Berlin, staring at another map, another illusion, while the Red Army closed in from the east. The irony was complete. The man who had built an empire on lies had been destroyed by a greater one. The final echoes of Operation Bodyguard would be felt long after the war ended. Its methods became the foundation of modern psychological warfare. The Ghost Army's descendants would appear in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, using sound, radio, and illusion to shape the battlefield. The art of deception had evolved from a desperate gamble into a weapon of strategy. But for those who lived it, who breathed the falsehoods day after day, there was no glory, only the haunting knowledge that an entire world had been moved by fiction. One of the last surviving officers of the London controlling section would later say, "We won because they believed what they saw, and what they saw never existed." When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts, cities reduced to ash, fields littered with rusting armor, rivers thick with the wreckage of history. Yet amid the ruins, another kind of ghost lingered, not the dead, but the unseen hands that had shaped victory through deception, silence, and shadow. Operation Bodyguard was over, but its spirit, the idea that illusion could be stronger than steel, remained. In London, the men and women who had built the deception watched the celebrations from the windows of their anonymous offices. The streets below were a roar of laughter and light, flags waving, champagne flowing. But inside, the architects of the Phantom War remained quiet. They could tell no one what they had done. Their triumph was sealed behind walls of secrecy. Colonel John Bevan, pale with exhaustion, stood before the locked cabinet that held the bodyguard files. "We fooled them all," he murmured. "But we fooled ourselves too." His assistant, a young woman from MI5 named Hester Leggett, nodded. "We had to," she said. "To make them believe, we had to believe first." Outside, church bells rang across the Thames, the same bells that had been silent since the Blitz. But even as victory echoed across the city, Bevan knew that somewhere in a shattered office in Berlin, German officers were still discovering the truth, realizing they had fought against an enemy that had never existed. In the ruins of the German High Command bunker at Zossen, Allied investigators sifted through piles of burnt papers. Among them, they found the last printed situation map of the Western Front, dated March 1945. The markings were meticulous. 1st U.S. Army Group, 15 divisions, poised at Dover. Even in the war's final weeks, the Phantom still lived. The deception had outlasted the Reich itself. In one surviving diary from a German intelligence officer, a single line was underlined twice. "We were defeated by what we could not see." That sentence, later quoted by Allied intelligence, became the epitaph for Operation Bodyguard. The story of how it all began. A handful of men in a smoke-filled room, daring to rewrite the very fabric of war, faded into classified silence. Bevan returned to civilian life, vanishing into quiet anonymity. Garbo, the double agent who had fooled Hitler himself, received the Iron Cross from the Germans and the MBE from the British, both unaware of the other. After the war, he disappeared into obscurity in Venezuela, his true identity unknown until decades later. For years, no one outside a small circle at MI5 knew how close the deception had come to failure, or how fragile it truly was. One intercepted message, one misplaced report, one skeptical analyst in Berlin could have unraveled it all. The ghosts had walked a razor's edge, but they had walked it perfectly. As the world rebuilt, the lessons of Operation Bodyguard rippled outward. At Fort Bragg, at Langley, in the cold corridors of Moscow and Washington, generals and spy masters studied it like scripture. Deception, they realized, was not just a tactic, it was an art form. The Cold War that followed would be shaped by this revelation. The invisible became the decisive. Wars would be fought in signals, in shadows, in whispers, and though the soldiers of Fusag were made of rubber and air, their descendants were made of code and silence. But the human cost was never forgotten by those who knew. The men of the Ghost Army, the artists, sound engineers, and radio men who had brought illusions to life, carried the weight of their own strange legacy. They had saved lives not by fighting, but by pretending to. Many would say later that they felt both pride and guilt. "We made ghosts," one of them said in an interview years later. But maybe that's better than making graves. In 1946, when the London Controlling Section was quietly disbanded, its members gathered one last time in a private ceremony. No medals, no cameras, no speeches. Bevan spoke only one line. "The truth," he said, "was the most dangerous weapon we never used." Then he turned the key, sealing the cabinet forever. For decades, the files of Operation Bodyguard remained classified, locked away in the archives of the British government. When they were finally declassified in the 1970s, historians could scarcely believe the scale of what had been done. The forged documents, the phantom armies, the lies woven so seamlessly into the machinery of war. One intelligence officer reviewing the documents for publication simply wrote in the margin, "Unthinkable, and yet true." Even today, in the museums of Dover and Portsmouth, a few relics remain. Inflatable tanks, faded camouflage nets, photographs of men painting shadows onto canvas armor. Tourists walk past them without realizing they are looking at the weapons that changed history. Tools of air and imagination that had fooled the most fearsome army on Earth. A single surviving radio set from Fusag still sits in a glass case, its dials frozen mid-transmission. The placard below it reads simply, "This machine spoke to the enemy, and the enemy listened." In Germany, decades later, a group of historians examined the surviving records of the Wehrmacht's intelligence corps. They concluded that between April and August 1944, more than half of all German operational reports in the West were based on Allied deception data. The enemy, one wrote, did not win by overwhelming force. They won by overwhelming belief. As night falls on the fields of Kent today where the fake tanks once stood, the wind still whistles through the hedgerows. The land bears no scars, no shell holes, no barbed wire, only silence. But if you look closely at dawn when the mist rolls low, you might still see the faint outlines of roads that led nowhere. Tire tracks that vanish into grass, ghosts of an army that never was. They were artists and engineers, liars and dreamers. They built an empire of illusion and in doing so, saved a world. The war was won not only by courage or blood or steel, but by faith in a lie so complete it became truth. And as the last survivors fade into history, one message remains in a whisper from a forgotten file, written in pencil in the margins of Bevan's notes. Never let them see what's real until it's too late.